He was a respected police officer, a family man, a devoted husband. But on an ordinary night, everything changed. His wife and 2 children were found dead in the garage, and he, David Camm, became the prime suspect. 3 trials, 13 years in prison, and one question that still divides opinions. Did David Camm commit this brutal crime, or was he the victim of one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in the American system? In this video, we're diving deep into the real-life case that shocked the United States, analyzing evidence, contradictions, court decisions, and what changed with each trial. Stay until the end, because the details you'll hear might turn your opinion upside down. It was a Friday evening, September 28, 2000. Around 7:30 p.m., David Camm, a former Indiana State Trooper, returned home after playing a game of basketball with friends. As he opened the garage door, he was met with a scene no human being is ever prepared to face. There, inside the garage, were his wife, Kim, and their 2 young children, Brad and Jill. The peace of their home had been shattered by something unimaginable. According to David's statement, he immediately panicked and tried to get help. The atmosphere was filled with shock and confusion. David was known in the community as a dedicated father and a respected man, with years of service in law enforcement. The Camm family was seen as stable, loving, and well-liked by neighbors and friends. They lived in Georgetown, a small town where everyone knew each other, and where tragedies felt like something that only happened far away. But that night, the unthinkable happened. News spread quickly, and the mood in the town shifted. Fear, heartbreak, and a desperate search for answers took over. What had happened to this family, and why? The scene discovered that night deeply shook the local investigators. From the very beginning, there was immense pressure to find answers quickly. A family had been struck by an unimaginable tragedy, and the small town of Georgetown was in shock. In moments like this, everyone demands clarity, and fast. David Camm, being the husband and father, immediately became the focus of the investigation. It was a common, though often controversial, move in cases like this. Statistically, people close to the victims are usually questioned first. But something started to shift, and it wasn't necessarily hard evidence, but rather impressions, behavior, and above all, assumptions. David stated that he had spent the evening playing basketball with friends. In fact, several people confirmed his presence at the game. Still, investigators began to grow suspicious. Some said his reaction upon discovering the scene was too calm or odd. Others believed he wasn't showing the kind of emotion they expected. But that raises an important question. Is there a right way to react when your entire world collapses? As hours passed, more elements started to weigh against David. A supposed stain on his shirt was interpreted as a sign of possible involvement. And even without conclusive evidence, he began to be seen less as a grieving father and more as a potential suspect. Rumors spread quickly. Neighbors, local newspapers, and even former colleagues began forming judgments based on fragments of information. By then, the public narrative had been shaped. David Camm, the officer and family man, might not be as innocent as he appeared. And once public opinion locks in, it's hard to turn back. Even with a consistent alibi and no direct evidence, the walls began to close in. Meanwhile, the pain of loss was still raw. The family, friends, and entire community were trying to process the shock. But for David, a much deeper struggle was just beginning. The fight to prove his innocence in a system that seemed to have already made up its mind. 2 years after the night that changed everything, David Camm found himself at the center of one of Indiana's most talked about trials. The case had become a public spectacle. His face was all over the headlines, and every detail of his life was picked apart in front of the cameras. Inside the courtroom, tension filled the air. The desire for a definitive answer was overwhelming and often stronger than the search for the truth. The prosecution built its case around a series of strategically interpreted details. A stain on David's shirt was presented as supposed evidence of direct involvement. Forensic experts argued that the pattern could not have occurred by accident. However, there was disagreement. Independent specialists hired by the defense claimed the pattern was inconclusive and easily open to other interpretations. David's behavior in the days following the tragedy was also heavily scrutinized. He had made jokes, tried to resume his routine, and at times appeared emotionally distant. To many, this was unacceptable, but to professionals in forensic psychology, such reactions can be natural defense mechanisms. Still, in the courtroom, those nuances were overshadowed by emotional judgment. The defense fought back hard. They presented David's alibi, confirmed by multiple people from the basketball game. They highlighted flaws in the investigation and the lack of direct evidence placing him at the scene at the critical moment. They warned of the danger of convicting a man based on interpretations, not facts. But the pressure was enormous and impossible to ignore. The jury, influenced by public opinion and the emotional weight of the case, reached a verdict: guilty. David was sentenced, and the decision was met with mixed reactions. Some of the community felt relief, believing justice had been served. Others, more quietly, began to question whether the trial had truly uncovered the truth or simply closed a painful chapter by assigning blame. What few people knew at that moment was that this was just the first chapter in a much longer battle. Because as David was led away to serve his sentence, new information began to surface. Patterns that had been overlooked, people who hadn't been questioned, and a story that, instead of settling, was starting to fall apart. David Camm had already been tried and convicted. For many, the story was over. But behind the scenes, something unsettling began to take shape. Independent experts, investigative journalists, and even members of the legal community started re-examining the case. And what they uncovered raised serious questions about what had really happened. The first major turning point came from a closer look at the forensic evidence. The stain on David's shirt, once presented as a key element in the trial, was now under scrutiny by new experts. Updated analyses showed that the method used to interpret it may have been flawed. Additionally, the chain of custody, how the shirt was collected, stored, and examined, revealed inconsistencies. Small oversights that, together, called the credibility of the evidence into question. But the biggest surprise was still to come. During this renewed investigation, a name that had been overlooked in the beginning resurfaced: Charles Boney. A man with a concerning past. His fingerprints had been found on an item recovered from the scene, something oddly ignored during the original investigation. As more evidence was cross-referenced with his name, the case began to shift. A deeper look into Boney's background revealed a troubling history and connections that clearly warranted further scrutiny. His version of events was full of inconsistencies. Even more startling, a piece of clothing linked to David, central to the original accusation, showed signs of having been handled or manipulated by someone else. These discoveries were critical in bringing the case back to court. A second trial was scheduled, with new evidence now in play. Many hoped the truth would finally come to light. But the outcome was even more shocking. David was convicted again. Despite the new findings, the introduction of Boney into the case, and expert testimony pointing out serious flaws in the original investigation, the jury once again ruled against David. For many, this raised a disturbing question. Was the justice system more interested in maintaining its narrative than in reassessing the facts fairly? Still, the case didn't end there. David's defense team kept fighting, filing appeals, demanding reviews, and pressing for a third trial. With each step, they uncovered more inconsistencies, more omissions, and more missed opportunities. This time, the case was no longer just about David Camm's freedom. It was about the integrity of the system itself. And now, the world was watching. After 2 trials, years of headlines, and 13 years behind bars, David Camm was granted a third trial. But this wasn't just another court proceeding, it was a defining moment. Not only for him, but for everyone who believed that somewhere along the way, the truth had been lost. This time, the defense team came more prepared than ever. They had spent years re-examining every file, every testimony, every misstep in the previous processes. More than just proving David's innocence, their mission was now to expose how the original investigation had been shaped by bias and pressure from the very beginning. From the start, this trial felt different. The jury was instructed to consider every element with a fresh, unbiased perspective. Charles Boney, a name that had previously been almost sidelined, was now placed at the center of the case. His background, his contradictions, and his possible involvement were explored in depth. What once seemed like a straightforward case now appeared far more complicated and potentially deeply flawed. Independent forensic experts were brought in to challenge the interpretations made in the earlier trials. They demonstrated how the methods used to analyze David's clothing didn't meet the most rigorous standards. They explained how certain details have been exaggerated or misunderstood. And most importantly, they revealed that what had once been seen as strong evidence might, in fact, have been nothing more than a misinterpreted coincidence. Witnesses who had remained silent or had been overlooked finally had their say. New testimonies shed light on hidden details, including possible investigative oversights and rushed decisions made in the early days after the incident. The trial went on for weeks. Each session peeled back another layer of complexity. But in the end, the verdict was different. David Camm was found not guilty. The decision shook the foundation of the case, not just because of the outcome, but because of what it represented. It wasn't just the release of one man. It was an official acknowledgement that serious mistakes had been made, and that for over a decade, justice had followed a path more rooted in assumption than in truth. David walked out of that courtroom a free man, but forever changed. His life had been interrupted. His name dragged through the public eye. His family irreversibly altered. But more than anything, the David Camm case became a symbol, a powerful reminder that even systems built to pursue justice can be led astray, and that the cost of those errors can be devastating. David Camm's acquittal marked the end of a long legal battle, but it didn't mean the end of the pain. After 13 years behind bars, returning to freedom came with an enormous void. Not just the time he had lost, but the irreversible absence of his wife and children. Though he was no longer in prison, David now carried emotional scars that no verdict could erase. Reintegrating into society proved to be a quiet struggle. Many still looked at him with suspicion, as if the weight of the accusations had never fully lifted. Rebuilding his personal and emotional life was a slow and often lonely process. In later interviews, David shared that what hurt the most wasn't just the time he spent imprisoned, but the feeling of being abandoned by the system meant to protect him and by many who once knew him. At the same time, David Camm's story began to resonate far beyond Indiana. Lawyers, scholars, journalists, and civil rights advocates began using his case as a powerful example of how investigative mistakes and rushed judgments could destroy lives. Law schools studied his case in their classrooms. Documentaries and major reports were produced. David's name became a symbol, not only of endurance, but of warning. The broader conversation about flaws in the justice system gained momentum. Issues such as public pressure, misuse of forensic science, and poorly handled investigations came into focus. The case inspired calls for reform in evidence handling protocols and raised awareness about the need for greater oversight in prosecution and trial procedures. David filed lawsuits against the state, seeking accountability for everything he had endured. But more than financial compensation, his fight became about visibility and change. He wanted to make sure that what happened to him would never happen to someone else. Today, years after the final verdict, the case of David Camm still sparks debate. It represents the darker side of justice, where haste, assumptions, and pre-shaped narratives can outweigh facts. His story challenges us to look more carefully, more empathetically, and more responsibly at every trial, every judgment, every life. Because behind every name in a headline, there's a human being. And when justice fails, the cost is immeasurable. Despite 3 trials, years of investigation, and nationwide media coverage, the David Camm case still raises questions that have never been fully answered. And perhaps that's what makes it so unsettling. Because in the end, even with a final court ruling, there's still a lingering feeling that something wasn't completely resolved. One of the biggest questions is, why were Charles Boney's fingerprints, found on a key item at the scene, initially ignored? How could such an important detail be overlooked in a case of this magnitude? Was it simple oversight? Or did someone intentionally steer the investigation toward the more convenient path? The one that already had a familiar face? David's? Another question that continues to trouble many observers. Why did certain pieces of evidence only come to light in the later trials? What prevented that information from being considered from the beginning? Were they forgotten? Withheld? Or did they not fit the narrative that had already been established? And then there are the concerns surrounding the prosecution's conduct. Why was there such resistance to exploring alternative possibilities? Why did it take years of external pressure for another suspect to be taken seriously? When the pursuit of justice turns into a fight to uphold a charge, the one who truly loses is the truth. These questions go beyond the David Camm case. They echo throughout the entire justice system. They reveal how, when there's urgency to convict, the margin for error increases, and how, even when facts evolve, the system isn't always willing to evolve with them. What really happened that tragic night? How were such critical decisions made based on such fragile interpretations? And how many similar cases are still out there, waiting for a second chance to be heard? These questions remain, and they may never have definitive answers. But that's exactly why telling stories like this matters so much, to remind us that beneath the reports, the files, and the expert testimony, there's something we must never forget: the honest search for truth. The David Camm case isn't just a story about a wrongful conviction. It's a warning, a reminder that even in systems designed to deliver justice, mistakes can, and do, happen. And when they do, the damage doesn't stop with the accused. It ripples outward, affecting families, entire communities, and the public's trust in what is right. Over the course of 3 trials, countless twists, and 13 years of lost time, the narrative shifted more than once. What began as a conviction built on questionable interpretations ended in an acquittal filled with lingering doubts and emotional scars. And while a final verdict was reached, the feeling remains that the questions never fully stopped. This story teaches us the importance of looking beyond the surface, that the first version isn't always the true one, and that pursuing real justice takes courage, patience, and, above all, the willingness to listen, even when the truth is uncomfortable. Now I want to hear from you. Was David Camm a victim of a broken system, or is there something deeper behind this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice is an essential part of this conversation. If this video moved you, made you reflect, or kept you watching until the end, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because here we continue to uncover real stories that need to be heard, told with depth, respect, and without unnecessary filters. Thank you so much for watching. And remember, not every truth makes the front page. Sometimes it hides between the lines few are willing to read.